February 3, 1945, brought the thunderous sound of American armor crashing through Manila's battered streets. Tank treads ground against broken pavement. Diesel engines roared between bombed buildings. Filipino civilians crawled from their hiding places. They waved scraps of cloth painted with American stars. Hope flickered in their eyes for the first time in 3 brutal years. The Pearl of the Orient was finally awakening from its nightmare. But beneath this joyous liberation, shadows held secrets that would remain buried for nearly 5 decades. In the smoking ruins of Japanese military compounds scattered across the Philippine Islands, American soldiers would soon stumble upon evidence. Evidence of crimes so systematic and brutal they defied comprehension. Evidence of one of the Second World War's most organized atrocities. Hidden in concrete bunkers and wooden barracks, they would discover women. Girls. Some barely past childhood. These survivors had been trapped in what Japanese military bureaucrats coldly labeled comfort stations. These women represented hundreds of thousands enslaved across Asia. They could barely grasp that their endless nightmare was finally ending. Their story begins not with freedom, but with conquest. Not with liberation, but with invasion. Not with hope, but with the systematic destruction of innocence on an industrial scale. December 8, 1941 brought more than Japanese military might to Philippine shores. The invasion fleet carried something darker than artillery and ammunition. They transported the infrastructure of enslavement, a system already spreading its tentacles across Korea, China, and occupied territories since 1932. The Comfort Women system emerged from cold military calculation, not battlefield chaos. Japanese imperial forces had designed this methodical operation. They controlled every aspect. They regulated every detail. According to researcher Chung Hung Kyung, Imperial Japan created this system to manage what they saw as practical problems. Sexual desires of soldiers needed channeling. Venereal diseases required control. Local women faced constant rape. Sex workers spread infection. Military command decided allegedly clean Korean women would solve these issues. Soldiers needed comfort and recreation. War anxiety affected troop morale. The system would address all these concerns. The scale staggered anyone who studied the evidence. Professor Yoshiaki Yoshimi of Chu University uncovered documentation buried in military archives. His research revealed 2,000 Comfort Women stations operating across the Japanese Empire. Approximately 200,000 women suffered in this system. Korean women formed the largest group. Filipino women numbered in the thousands. Taiwanese women disappeared into stations. Indonesian women vanished from villages. Burmese women were seized from homes. Dutch women faced capture. Australian women met this fate. Even Japanese women found themselves trapped. Many victims were teenagers, some were children. Conservative estimates suggested 200,000 women total. Other scholars pushed numbers higher. Some research indicated 400,000 women may have been enslaved. In the Philippines, specifically, investigators calculated that roughly 1,000 women and girls were dragged into military sex slave camps. The occupation lasted from 1942 to 1945. 3 years of systematic brutality. These devastating numbers cannot capture individual terror. Statistics fail to convey personal anguish. Each woman experienced her own unique hell. Consider Maria Rosa Henson, whose memoir would later break decades of silence. Her account became one of the first published testimonies by a Filipino comfort woman. April 1943 began like any other day for 15-year-old Maria Rosa. She performed her usual household chores. Her hands worked automatically. Her mind wandered to simple pleasures. Then Japanese soldiers appeared. They seized her from her village without warning. No explanation, no farewell, no mercy. Like thousands of other young women across Asia, she was transported to a garrison. The military had converted the building into what their documents termed a comfort station. Clinical language masked unspeakable reality. Japanese military records reveal the calculated nature of this system. No aspect was left to chance. Every detail was planned and documented. The Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers later compiled research reports. In Manila alone, investigators found 12 houses of relaxation. 5 brothels served privates and non-commissioned officers. The facilities operated with bureaucratic precision. War prisoners later provided testimony to American interrogators. They witnessed 5 or 6 comfort stations operating in Manila. Korean women filled some facilities. Filipino women were held in others. Chinese women completed the roster. These establishments operated openly. They formed part of standard military infrastructure. Detailed regulations governed their use like any other military facility. The regulations covered medical examinations with mechanical precision. Pricing schedules varied by military rank. Different prices for officers and enlisted men. Different rates for different services. This was not battlefield chaos erupting into violence. This was bureaucracy applied to human trafficking. Government efficiency directed toward enslavement. The women trapped in these stations came from every level of Filipino society. Poverty made some families more vulnerable than others. Rural communities offered less protection. Urban areas provided more witnesses, but not necessarily more safety. Many women were deceived with promises of legitimate employment. Factory work was mentioned. Nursing positions were offered. Seamstress jobs were described. Others were simply seized during military raids. Villages suspected of harboring guerrillas faced collective punishment. Once inside the comfort stations, escape became nearly impossible. The facilities featured heavy guard presence. Many were located within military compounds. Others sat adjacent to military installations. The women faced constant surveillance every hour of every day. Any attempt to flee met severe punishment. Beatings were standard. Torture was common. Death threats were routine. Survivors recall being beaten unconscious for resistance. They remembered torture sessions designed to break their spirits. They lived under constant threat of execution if they tried to escape. The guards made examples of women who attempted flight. Public punishments sent clear messages to others. The daily reality crushed spirits through systematic brutality. Women faced dozens of soldiers each day. Some days brought 50 men. Other days brought more. They received minimal food, often just rice and scraps. Medical care was inadequate when it existed at all. They lived in constant fear every waking moment. Many became pregnant despite precautions. They faced forced abortions under primitive conditions. Disease spread rapidly through crowded facilities. Medical treatment focused on keeping women functional. Their health mattered only as it served military needs. Personal dignity was completely abandoned. American submarines began devastating Japanese supply lines as the war progressed. Conditions in comfort stations deteriorated even further. Food became increasingly scarce. Medical supplies disappeared entirely. Women found themselves abandoned by guards. Japanese personnel fled to prepare for approaching liberation forces. The psychological toll matched the physical abuse in its devastating impact. These women came from deeply traditional societies. A woman's honor was considered sacred by their families. They faced not only the trauma of sexual enslavement, They also carried knowledge that their experiences would likely make them outcasts. Their own communities might reject them. This double burden created wounds lasting lifetimes. The immediate horror combined with anticipated shame. Both would haunt survivors forever. Meanwhile, American forces advanced steadily across the Pacific toward the Philippines. The island-hopping campaign brought them through the Central Pacific. Each victory brought them closer to the Philippines. By late 1944, General Douglas MacArthur prepared to fulfill his famous promise. "I shall return." Those 3 words carried the hopes of an entire nation. The American soldiers approaching Philippine liberation remained largely unaware of what awaited them. Their intelligence briefings focused on Japanese military positions. Troop strengths received attention. Strategic objectives dominated planning sessions. The existence of comfort stations was not part of mission briefings. Some soldiers had heard rumors from interrogated prisoners of war, but these reports seemed too horrible to believe. Many American soldiers were young men themselves, some barely older than the women they would soon liberate. They came from Iowa farms where corn grew tall in summer heat. They left Detroit factories where assembly lines never stopped. They traveled from neighborhoods across America where families worried and waited. They joined the military to fight fascism. They wanted to defend democracy. They had no frame of reference for systematic sexual enslavement. Nothing in their experience prepared them for what lay ahead. October 20th, 1944 marked the beginning of Philippine liberation. MacArthur's landing on Leyte became the first step in a brutal campaign. The fighting proved bloody and devastating. Japanese forces determined to make their final stand in the Philippines. The Japanese Imperial General Staff decided to defend the islands at all costs. Every available soldier was sent. Every airplane was committed. Every naval vessel joined the defense. American forces fought their way across Philippine islands. They were often amazed by enthusiastic reception from Filipino civilians. After 3 years of brutal occupation, the sight of American soldiers represented the end of a nightmare. The nightmare had consumed an entire nation. Children who had never known peace suddenly saw hope. But Japanese military leaders faced inevitable defeat. They began implementing increasingly desperate measures. In many areas, they intensified pacification campaigns. They rounded up suspected guerrillas and collaborators. The violence reached a crescendo during the Battle of Manila. American forces entered the capital on February 3, 1945. The battle for Manila became one of the most destructive urban combat operations of the entire war. Japanese naval forces found themselves cut off from escape. They were determined not to surrender. They engaged in what can only be described as systematic terror against Filipino civilians. The fighting eventually claimed over 100,000 lives. Manila lay in ruins. During this period of chaos and destruction, many comfort stations were discovered by advancing American forces. Some women were found locked inside burning buildings. Their captors had abandoned them. Guards had fled or been killed in the fighting. Other women emerged from hiding places. They had remained hidden for days or weeks. They did not know if approaching soldiers were friend or foe. The initial encounters between American liberators and comfort women were marked by mutual incomprehension. The women had been traumatized by years of abuse. They were conditioned to fear all soldiers. They could hardly believe these Americans intended to help rather than harm them. Many had been told by Japanese captors that American soldiers were brutal monsters. They were warned Americans would treat them even worse than their current situation. American soldiers found themselves shocked by what they discovered. These were not military brothels that existed near American bases. Those were regulated establishments where women worked for money. These were concentration camps. Women and girls had been held as slaves. The systematic nature of abuse challenged understanding. The youth of many victims horrified observers. The official military sanction of the system challenged their concept of warfare and human dignity. Staff Sergeant John Morrison of the 24th Infantry Division later recalled finding a group of women. They were hiding in a bombed-out building near Fort Santiago in Manila. They were terrified when they saw us, he remembered. They did not speak English, but you could see the fear in their eyes. It took our interpreter hours to convince them. We were not going to hurt them. The language barrier complicated these early encounters significantly. Few American soldiers spoke Tagalog. Many of the women spoke only their local dialects. Some Korean comfort women could communicate in Japanese. This often made American soldiers suspicious. They did not understand these women had been forced to learn Japanese during captivity. Medical officers examined the women. They discovered evidence of systematic abuse that shook even veteran combat medics. Many suffered from sexually transmitted diseases. Malnutrition was common. Untreated injuries were visible everywhere. Some bore scars from beatings and torture. Others showed signs of forced abortions performed under primitive conditions. Captain Robert Chen served as a medical officer with the Sixth Army. He documented what he saw in official reports. These reports would later be classified and forgotten for decades. The physical condition of these women was evidence of prolonged abuse, he wrote. Many appeared to be suffering from what we would now recognize as severe psychological trauma. They seemed unable to believe their ordeal was over. The women's disbelief was completely understandable. For many, the comfort station had been their entire world for months or years. They had lived under constant threat. They never knew if they would survive another day. The sudden appearance of foreign soldiers speaking an unfamiliar language seemed impossible. Making promises of freedom seemed too good to be true. Some women initially refused medical treatment. They rejected offers of food. They feared acceptance would lead to new forms of exploitation. Years of conditioning had taught them harsh lessons. Kindness from soldiers was always followed by demands for sexual service. The concept of unconditional help from military personnel was foreign to their experience. Many remained suspicious for days or weeks. American military chaplains were often called upon to help in these situations. Red Cross workers also provided assistance. Their non-combatant status made them less threatening to traumatized women. Their focus on humanitarian aid sometimes broke through defensive barriers. Chaplain William Foster of the 41st Infantry Division noted observations in his diary. "These women have suffered something beyond the normal horrors of war," he wrote. "They look at us with a mixture of hope and terror, as if they cannot quite believe their nightmare might be ending." The liberation process was complicated by practical considerations. American forces remained engaged in active combat operations. Their primary mission was defeating Japanese military resistance. Providing extensive social services was not their focus. Many units lacked the resources needed. They had no time for proper care of traumatized civilian populations. They lacked expertise in dealing with such situations. American military authorities were often unsure how to classify these women. Existing frameworks of international law provided no guidance. Military procedure offered no precedents. Were they prisoners of war? Were they civilian refugees? Were they crime victims? The comfort women system had no precedent in American military experience. Standard operating procedures provided no guidance for these unique circumstances. Some American commanders initially tried to categorize comfort stations as ordinary military brothels. They did not understand the coercive nature of the system. This led to tragic misunderstandings. Women were initially treated as prostitutes rather than victims of systematic enslavement. Only as more evidence emerged did American authorities begin grasping the true nature of their discovery. The cultural gap between American soldiers and Filipino civilians complicated the liberation process further. Many Americans carried racial prejudices despite good intentions. These prejudices affected their interactions with Asian populations. Some viewed all Asians through the lens of their enemy. The Japanese military created this perspective. They struggled to distinguish between victims and collaborators. Filipino guerrilla forces served as crucial intermediaries in these encounters. Their knowledge of local languages proved invaluable. Their understanding of customs helped bridge gaps. Their knowledge of Japanese occupation practices made them essential. They could identify and help comfort women when Americans could not. Guerrilla leaders like Colonel Ruperto Canglion in Leyte maintained resistance throughout the war. Major Macario Peralta in Panay coordinated intelligence networks. They had documented Japanese atrocities throughout the occupation. This included establishment of comfort stations. Their reports provided American forces with crucial context. Understanding came through their assistance. But even with local assistance, liberation revealed profound challenges. Addressing systematic sexual violence as a war crime proved difficult. International law in 1945 provided limited frameworks. Prosecuting such crimes had no precedents. Providing adequate support for survivors was uncharted territory. The Geneva Conventions would not address these issues for decades. American forces consolidated control of liberated territories. The immediate priority became providing basic humanitarian assistance to all civilian populations. Comfort women were often housed in refugee camps alongside other displaced persons. Their specific needs received little specialized attention. Their traumas were not understood or addressed properly. The women faced additional challenges in refugee camps. Many Filipino civilians were aware of comfort stations, but they did not understand the coercive nature of the system. They viewed the women with suspicion or contempt. The stigma associated with sexual contact with enemy soldiers made integration extremely difficult. Circumstances did not matter to many observers. Some women chose to hide their experiences rather than face social ostracism. They invented cover stories about wartime activities. They claimed to have worked in factories. They said they fled to mountains to join guerrilla forces. This silence protected them from immediate social consequences. But it also meant their experiences went undocumented and unrecognized. Others found themselves unable to return to home communities. Shame prevented return. Family rejection was feared. Simple geographical displacement created barriers. The war had destroyed many villages. Families were scattered across the archipelago. Without identification documents, family connections, or economic resources, many former comfort women found themselves permanently adrift in post-war Philippine society. The American military government administered the Philippines during the immediate post-war period. They were overwhelmed with reconstruction challenges. Rebuilding infrastructure took priority. Establishing civil government demanded attention. Managing transition to Philippine independence consumed resources. Investigating war crimes against individual civilians received little focus. Many documents related to comfort stations were destroyed by retreating Japanese forces. This made it difficult for American investigators to build comprehensive cases. War crimes prosecutions required evidence. Without documentary proof, and with witnesses too traumatized or ashamed to testify, the systematic nature of the comfort women system remained largely hidden from official American records. The immediate emergency of war transitioned to longer-term challenges of peace. The liberation of comfort women began fading from American military consciousness. Units rotated home to waiting families. Personnel changed as war ended. New priorities emerged in peacetime. The women discovered in those chaotic days of February and March 1945 found themselves largely forgotten by the forces that had freed them. But their liberation, however incomplete, represented a crucial turning point. It marked a change in their lives and in the broader struggle for recognition of wartime sexual violence. The American soldiers who discovered them may not have fully understood what they had found, but they had opened a door that could never be completely closed again. The documentation created during those early encounters was scattered across military archives and individual testimonies. It would eventually provide crucial evidence for the long struggle for justice that lay ahead. The liberation of 1945 was just the beginning. A much longer journey toward recognition, acknowledgement, and healing stretched ahead. For the women themselves, liberation brought both relief and new challenges. Freedom from immediate terror of comfort stations did not erase years of trauma. Social stigma would not disappear with liberation. Many would struggle for decades to rebuild their lives. They carried psychological scars that no amount of time would completely heal. Yet their survival represented a form of resistance in itself. By living through the systematic attempt to reduce them to objects for military use, they preserved something essential. They maintained their own humanity. They also preserved evidence of crimes that the world needed to remember. The liberation by American forces in 1945 was incomplete in many ways, but it was the first step in a longer journey toward justice and recognition. That journey continues to this day. The chaotic battlefield encounters of February and March 1945 lacked ceremony and documentation. Other aspects of Philippine liberation were marked with fanfare. There were no photographers capturing the moment when comfort women first saw American soldiers. No official proclamations marked their freedom. No brass bands played as they walked out of stations where they had been held. But in the memories of the women themselves, and in scattered recollections of American soldiers who found them, these moments represented something profound. The first glimpse of hope after years of darkness. The first possibility that their voices might someday be heard. The first evidence that their suffering had not been invisible to the world. The liberation of Philippine comfort women in 1945 was messy, incomplete, and often misunderstood. But it was real, and it mattered deeply. It represented not just the end of their immediate captivity. It marked the beginning of a longer struggle for recognition. That struggle would eventually span continents and decades. It would challenge the world to confront one of the darkest chapters in the history of warfare against women. The immediate aftermath of liberation brought unexpected challenges that no one had anticipated. In refugee camps across the newly liberated Philippines, former comfort women found themselves facing a reality almost as complex as their captivity had been. Freedom, they discovered, was not simply the absence of chains. Narcisa Claveria had been held for 18 months at a garrison in Luzon. She later recalled the confusion of those first weeks of freedom. Through an interpreter, she remembered specific details. We did not know what to do with ourselves. For so long, every moment of our day had been controlled. Every action was dictated by others. Suddenly, we were told we were free. But free to do what? Free to go where? The American military government was overwhelmed with the massive task of reconstructing a war-torn nation. They established processing centers for displaced civilians. But these facilities were designed for conventional refugees. They were not equipped for women who had survived systematic sexual enslavement. The psychological support that trauma specialists today would consider essential simply did not exist in 1945. Dr. Margaret Chen was one of the few female physicians serving with American forces in the Philippines. She documented her observations in reports that would remain classified for decades. Her medical expertise provided unique insights into the challenges facing liberated comfort women. These women displayed behaviors that medical staff had never witnessed before. Their constant vigilance struck observers immediately. They seemed frozen in permanent watchfulness. Every sound made them flinch. Every shadow caused alarm. Sleep became their enemy. Many refused beds in closed rooms. Open spaces felt safer somehow. Male staff members triggered immediate panic. It didn't matter how gentle their approach was. Gender alone sparked terror responses that seemed impossible to calm. The doctor wrote detailed observations in her reports. These patients exist in a state of perpetual alertness. They scan every room upon entering. Their eyes dart constantly toward exits. New threats seem to lurk around every corner in their minds. Their bodies told stories of trauma that words couldn't express. Shoulders hunched forward defensively. Arms wrapped protectively around torsos. Backs pressed against walls whenever possible. Standing in open spaces caused visible distress. The physical manifestations of psychological wounds were unmistakable. Communication barriers that had complicated first contact continued creating problems. American units sometimes had interpreters available. Few possessed training for discussing trauma. Personal experiences remained largely inaccessible. Simple questions triggered unexpected reactions. Names, ages, home villages became dangerous topics. Interpreters found themselves unprepared for these responses. Standard military interrogation techniques proved useless. These women weren't enemy combatants requiring information extraction. They were trauma victims needing careful handling. The difference wasn't immediately clear to personnel. Training focused on battlefield situations. Civilian trauma fell outside their expertise completely. Private First Class David Nakamura served with the 402nd Regimental Combat Team. His Japanese language skills made him valuable for translation work. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved. A Japanese-American soldier helping women traumatized by Japanese forces. History created strange circles that way. Speaking Japanese became one of the hardest assignments he ever received. These women recoiled when they heard the language, even from an American soldier trying to help them. The sound itself carried too much pain. Too many terrible memories flooded back instantly. Nakamura learned to approach very carefully. Soft tones helped somewhat. Slow movements reduced panic slightly. But complete trust never developed. The language barrier remained emotional as much as linguistic. Fear lived in those syllables regardless of who spoke them. Cultural complications made liberation extremely complex in unexpected ways. Traditional Filipino society placed enormous emphasis on family honor. Female chastity connected directly to community standing. Many women understood this connection too well. Their experiences threatened everything their families valued most. The shame they carried wasn't just personal. Entire families faced potential disgrace. Communities might reject them completely. Marriage prospects disappeared entirely. Social death seemed certain. These cultural realities made psychological recovery even more difficult than physical healing. Some community members didn't understand the coercive nature of the system. They viewed the women with suspicion instead of sympathy. Whispers followed them through villages. Judgmental stares replaced compassionate looks. Blame replaced support in too many cases. Maria Santos experienced this rejection firsthand after her liberation. She had been abducted from her village in Bataan at just 16 years old. Returning home should have been joyful. Instead, it became another form of trauma entirely. Her own mother's reaction devastated her completely. The woman who had given birth to her couldn't meet her eyes. Rumors had reached the village before Maria did. Shame replaced love in her mother's heart. The daughter she had mourned was now a source of embarrassment. This social stigma wasn't unique to Philippine culture. Throughout Asia, societies influenced by Confucian values emphasized female purity above almost everything else. Women who had experienced sexual assault faced blame regardless of circumstances. The victims became the accused in community courts of opinion. Cultural attitudes proved more resistant to change than military fortifications. Defeating Japanese forces required strategy and firepower. Changing deep-rooted beliefs demanded something much more difficult. Generations of tradition couldn't be overturned by liberation alone. Comfort women faced double trauma in many cases. The original abuse during captivity was only the beginning. Social rejection by their own communities created ongoing psychological wounds. Liberation from physical captivity didn't guarantee freedom from cultural imprisonment. Some American soldiers and officers recognized these cultural dynamics. They attempted to address them through community outreach. Chaplain Robert Morrison organized meetings in liberated towns. He tried explaining that the women were victims rather than participants. "These women are heroes," he told skeptical village leaders. "They survived something terrible so they could return to their families. They deserve respect, not judgment." His words carried moral authority but faced cultural resistance. Changing minds proved far more challenging than changing governments. Community meetings sometimes helped shift attitudes slightly, but private conversations often revealed persistent doubts. Whispered conversations continued spreading harmful rumors. Social healing required much more time than physical liberation. Cultural wounds needed different medicine entirely. Many women discovered that liberation from comfort stations marked the beginning rather than the end of their struggles. Freedom from physical captivity didn't guarantee acceptance by society. Dignity had to be fought for long after the war ended. Respect became something they had to earn back, rather than something automatically granted. Medical challenges faced by liberated comfort women were overwhelming in scope. Army medical records revealed shocking statistics decades later. Over 70% showed signs of sexually transmitted diseases. Advanced stages were common due to lack of treatment during captivity. Medical neglect had been systematic and deliberate. Malnutrition affected nearly every woman examined. Untreated injuries created ongoing complications. Forced abortions had left many with permanent damage. The physical toll of systematic abuse was measured in scars both visible and hidden. Captain Elizabeth Rodriguez was among the few female medical officers in the Pacific Theater. She supervised care for comfort women at a field hospital in Manila. Her reports documented conditions that shocked even experienced military doctors. "The physical injuries were terrible enough," she wrote in official reports. But psychological trauma seemed far more devastating. These women had been systematically dehumanized over months or years. Rebuilding their sense of self-worth exceeded medical capabilities of that era. Medical protocols designed for treating combat injuries among soldiers proved inadequate. Sexual trauma survivors needed different approaches entirely. No procedures existed for addressing systematic abuse. Understanding of what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder didn't exist yet. Specialized training for dealing with organized sexual violence was non-existent. Basic medical treatment addressed physical ailments when possible. Antibiotics helped fight infections. Surgery repaired some damage. Nutrition programs restored weight gradually. But psychological wounds remained invisible to medical personnel of that time period. Discharge from military care came as soon as physical stability was achieved. The invisible wounds went untreated completely. No follow-up care was provided for psychological trauma. Long-term consequences would unfold over lifetimes without professional support. This medical abandonment created problems that lasted generations. Mental health resources weren't available in civilian communities either. Traditional healing practices didn't address trauma of this magnitude. The women were left to heal themselves or not heal at all. As 1945 progressed, American attention shifted toward post-war Reconstruction priorities. The immediate crisis atmosphere that had focused some attention on comfort, women, began fading away. Military personnel rotated home to waiting families. Emergency medical facilities closed down systematically. The Philippines moved toward independence and self-governance. In this changing environment, the women's needs became increasingly invisible to authorities. Other priorities demanded attention and resources. Infrastructure required rebuilding. Government needed establishing. Economic recovery took precedence. Individual trauma stories got lost in larger historical movements. The establishment of the United Nations raised hopes among some advocates later that year. International law might address crimes like the comfort women system. Eleanor Roosevelt chaired the UN Commission on Human Rights. She received reports about systematic sexual violence during the war. But political realities of the emerging Cold War complicated everything. Comprehensive accountability for wartime sexual crimes remained elusive. Geopolitical considerations outweighed human rights concerns. Justice became secondary to strategic alliances. The comfort women's voices were drowned out by louder political demands. Meanwhile, the women themselves faced difficult choices about their futures independently. Some attempted returning to their home villages, with mixed results at best. Family reception ranged from cautious acceptance to outright rejection. Community attitudes varied dramatically between locations. Others remained in Manila or other cities permanently. Anonymity offered protection from judgment. Urban environments provided more opportunities for work. Starting over meant leaving the past behind as much as possible. A few married American soldiers who were preparing to return home. Marriage represented escape to a new life in America. Distance from Philippine stigma seemed like the only solution. Starting fresh in a foreign country appeared preferable to facing shame at home. Rosa Mercado had been held at a comfort station in Cebu during the occupation. She met Staff Sergeant William Thompson while recovering at a Red Cross facility. Their courtship developed slowly despite significant barriers. Language differences complicated every conversation. Cultural misunderstandings created frequent confusion. But Thompson showed remarkable patience and kindness throughout their relationship. He never asked about her experiences during the war years. Those questions would have been too painful to answer anyway. The past was the past, he said simply. They were building a future together instead. Their marriage in 1946 was one of thousands between American servicemen and Filipino women. For Rosa, it represented much more than love alone. Liberation from a society that viewed her with suspicion was equally important. In America, she could reinvent herself completely. The memories would always remain, but the social judgment could be left behind. But for every woman who found a path forward successfully, many others remained trapped. Cycles of poverty affected most former comfort women disproportionately. Social isolation compounded economic problems. Shame prevented them from seeking help when available. Without education, job skills, or family support, they found themselves among the most vulnerable members of post-war Filipino society. Opportunities for advancement were severely limited. Discrimination followed them into employment situations. Economic independence seemed nearly impossible to achieve. The American military's final reports on Philippine liberation made minimal mention of comfort women discoveries. Focus remained on military achievements and strategic objectives. Casualty figures received more attention than survivor stories. The women found in bombed-out stations became footnotes in official history. This institutional forgetting wasn't necessarily intentional or malicious. The American military faced massive logistical challenges during demobilization. Millions of soldiers needed transportation home. Destroyed infrastructure required rebuilding. Managing the transition to peace demanded enormous resources. Individual trauma stories were easily lost in broader historical events, but forgetting had serious consequences for the women involved. Without official documentation and recognition, their experiences were relegated to private memory. Personal testimony became the only record. This made seeking justice or support far more difficult in later years. Political climate might have been more receptive to their claims eventually. But without official records, proving their experiences became nearly impossible. The silence imposed by shame and social pressure was reinforced by institutional neglect. Their stories risked disappearing completely from historical memory. As the 1940s ended, most women liberated from comfort stations had disappeared into the broader Philippine population. Some had found ways to rebuild their lives successfully. Others continued struggling with poverty and social rejection daily. All carried memories that would shape the rest of their lives permanently. The silence surrounding their experiences was personal, institutional, and social simultaneously. Filipino society focused on rebuilding and moving forward economically. Confronting systematic sexual violence wasn't a priority for most people. American society celebrated victory and prosperity instead. Examining darker aspects of Pacific warfare held little interest for most citizens. This silence persisted for decades after the war ended. Women who had been liberated in 1945 grew older gradually. They had children, worked jobs, lived normal lives on the surface. Many took their stories to their graves without sharing them with families. Shame and stigma made disclosure too dangerous for most survivors. But memory preserved what official history forgot systematically. In the hearts and minds of survivors, details of captivity and liberation remained vivid. Slowly, over the decades that followed, some would find courage to speak. The first cracks in the wall of silence began appearing in the 1980s. Academic researchers investigating wartime atrocities uncovered references to the comfort women system in military archives. Feminist scholars began framing sexual violence in war as a human rights issue rather than an inevitable byproduct of conflict. New frameworks for understanding systematic abuse were developing gradually. In South Korea, the women's movement of the late 1980s created space for comfort women survivors to share their stories. Democratization meant that criticism of Japan was no longer suppressed by authoritarian governments eager to maintain diplomatic relations. Political opening made truth-telling possible for the first time. Kim Hak-sun became the first Korean comfort woman to publicly testify about her experiences in 1991. Her courage inspired women across Asia, including Filipinas, who had remained silent for nearly half a century. Suddenly, the liberation that had begun in 1945 was taking on completely new dimensions. In 1992, Rosa Henson became the first Filipina to publicly identify herself as a former comfort woman. At a press conference in Manila, she broke decades of silence to tell her story publicly. Her voice trembled at first, but grew stronger with each word spoken. "I am not ashamed," she declared firmly to assembled reporters. "The ones who should be ashamed are those who did this to us, and those who refuse to acknowledge what happened to innocent women." Her testimony opened floodgates for other Filipino survivors who had been waiting decades for permission to speak. Organizations like Lila Pilipina were founded to support former comfort women and advocate for recognition and reparations. The women who had been liberated as teenagers in 1945 were now grandmothers in their 70s. But their voices were finally being heard by the world. Their stories were finally being believed and documented properly. The parallels between their physical liberation in 1945 and their social liberation in the 1990s were striking and significant. In both cases, external forces created opportunities for the women to break free from constraints. First American soldiers, then international human rights movements opened doors that had seemed permanently sealed. But the second liberation differed in crucial ways from the first. This time, the women weren't passive recipients of rescue efforts. They became active agents of their own freedom instead. They chose to speak publicly. They chose to organize politically. They chose to demand justice through legal channels. Their silence had been imposed by shame and social pressure originally. Their voices emerged from strength and solidarity eventually. The contrast couldn't have been more dramatic or meaningful for the women involved. Empowerment replaced victimization in their public presentations of self. International attention focused on the comfort women issue throughout the 1990s. The United Nations Commission on Human Rights launched formal investigations. Legal scholars debated whether the comfort women system constituted crimes against humanity under international law. Activists organized protests and memorial campaigns globally. In 1993, the Japanese government issued the Kono Statement, partially acknowledging military involvement in the comfort women system. While falling short of full legal responsibility, it represented the first official recognition that the system had existed. Military involvement in its operation was admitted for the first time. For Filipino survivors, this acknowledgement carried deep meaning despite its limitations. They had waited nearly 50 years for any recognition at all. Many had died without ever seeing their experiences validated by official sources. Those who remained alive continued calling for more comprehensive apologies and reparations. The American role in the comfort women issue also began receiving new attention from historians and activists. Records of liberation encounters were uncovered in military archives. Some former American servicemen began sharing their memories of discoveries made in 1945. Their testimonies provided important historical documentation. Sergeant John Morrison, now in his 80s, testified before a congressional hearing in 2007. He spoke about finding comfort women in Manila decades earlier. His voice carried the weight of years and the burden of memory as he addressed the assembled lawmakers. "We knew we had found something terrible," he said slowly. "But we didn't have the language to understand what we were seeing clearly. These women had been enslaved, but that word wasn't part of our vocabulary then. We did our best with what we understood at the time." His testimony, combined with that of other veterans, helped establish that American forces had encountered the comfort women system directly. Some understanding of its coercive nature existed among military personnel. This documentation became crucial for legal and historical arguments about accountability and recognition. The comfort women liberation story took on new significance in contemporary discussions about sexual violence in conflict zones. International legal frameworks developed in response to atrocities in the Balkans, and Rwanda drew explicit connections to the comfort women precedent. Historical events informed current legal standards. The International Criminal Court, established in 2002, included sexual slavery as a crime against humanity. Founding documents made explicit reference to the comfort women system. The liberation of 1945 had helped establish legal principles that would be applied to conflicts decades later. In the Philippines, the legacy of comfort women liberation continued evolving through memorialization efforts. Museums and memorials were established to preserve survivor testimonies permanently. The Bahay Napula, a former comfort station in Luzon, became a site of remembrance for visitors learning about atrocities and liberation. Educational programs began including the Comfort Women story as part of World War II's history curricula. Young Filipinos learned about military battles and political changes, but they also learned about women who survived systematic sexual violence and lived to tell their stories courageously. The bronze statue of a comfort woman installed briefly in Manila in 2017 sparked controversy, but demonstrated that recognition remained politically sensitive. The statue's removal after Japanese diplomatic pressure showed that struggles for acknowledgement were far from over completely. For surviving comfort women now in their 90s, the recognition they had achieved was both vindication and bittersweet victory. Many had lived most of their lives carrying trauma in silence, unable to share experiences even with their own children and grandchildren. Public acknowledgement came too late for full healing, but provided dignity they had been denied for decades. As of 2020, only about 40 Filipino comfort women survivors remained alive worldwide. Their advanced age made each interview precious. Each testimony became historically invaluable. Each public appearance represented living links to historical atrocity that might otherwise be forgotten or denied by future generations. Their liberation in 1945 had been incomplete, constrained by limitations of that historical moment. Social, medical, and legal frameworks needed to address systematic sexual violence simply didn't exist yet. American soldiers did their best with understanding and resources available to them, but true liberation required decades of additional struggle. The second liberation, beginning in the 1990s, was also incomplete, but more comprehensive than the first. It included legal recognition, financial support, and social acknowledgement from governments and international organizations. Most importantly, it centered the voices and agency of the women themselves. They could define their own experiences and demand their own forms of justice. Today, the Comfort Women Liberation story serves multiple purposes in historical memory and contemporary activism. It documents a specific wartime atrocity and the complex process of addressing its aftermath across generations. It illustrates how liberation can be both immediate and prolonged, both physical and psychological, both individual and collective in nature. American soldiers who discovered comfort stations in 1945 could never have imagined their brief encounters with traumatized women would contribute to international legal frameworks. The women they liberated couldn't have foreseen that their survival would inspire global movements for women's rights and historical justice decades later. But the connections are real and historically significant. The liberation of 1945 was imperfect and incomplete, but necessary. It was the essential first step in a longer journey toward justice and recognition. It demonstrated that systematic sexual violence could be exposed publicly. Victims could survive and eventually thrive. Societies could confront their most painful histories. The legacy extends beyond the specific historical context of World War II in the Philippines entirely. It has become a symbol of both the persistence of sexual violence in conflict and the possibility of seeking justice across decades and international borders. Multiple generations may be required to achieve true liberation. For contemporary advocates working to address sexual violence in current conflict zones, the Comfort Women story provides both inspiration and practical instruction. It demonstrates the importance of documenting atrocities as they occur. Supporting survivors immediately and over the long term remains crucial. Maintaining pressure for accountability matters even when political conditions seem unfavorable. American soldiers who liberated comfort stations in 1945 were ordinary men faced with extraordinary circumstances beyond their experience. They responded with basic human decency, providing immediate relief and safety to women in desperate need. Their actions, however limited by constraints of their time, created possibilities that wouldn't be fully realized for decades. The women they liberated were also ordinary people who had survived extraordinary circumstances through strength and endurance. Their decision to eventually break silence and demand recognition required tremendous courage. They created opportunities for justice that continue expanding today. Their legacy grows stronger with each passing year. Together, their story illustrates that liberation is never a single moment, but an ongoing process requiring sustained commitment. It demands immediate action to address urgent needs. It requires sustained effort to create lasting change over generations. Individual courage must combine with collective commitment to justice for meaningful progress. Philippine comfort women who encountered American liberators in 1945 could hardly have believed their nightmare was ending permanently. Their skepticism was justified by their experiences and by the incomplete nature of their initial liberation from physical captivity. Social and psychological freedom would take much longer to achieve, but their survival created possibilities for future liberation they couldn't have imagined in their darkest moments. Their story continues resonating because it captures both the worst and best of human nature simultaneously. It documents systematic cruelty and exploitation, but it also celebrates resilience, compassion, and the persistent human drive toward justice and dignity. As the last survivors pass away, their legacy will be preserved in testimonies, memorials, and legal precedents they helped establish. But perhaps most importantly, it will live on in ongoing struggles to prevent sexual violence in conflict. Supporting survivors of systematic abuse remains a continuing obligation for civilized societies everywhere. The liberation of comfort women in 1945 was the beginning, not the end of their story of survival and resistance. It opened a door that could never be fully closed again. Space was created for voices that would eventually demand to be heard. Experiences would eventually demand acknowledgement. Justice would eventually demand to be served. Their liberation was imperfect and incomplete by any measure, but it was real and meaningful to the women who experienced it. In its reality lay seeds of future liberation for countless women facing similar circumstances in conflicts yet to come. Hope was planted in the darkest soil of human experience. American soldiers who found them in bombed-out stations in 1945 could never have imagined the global movement their simple acts of human decency would help inspire eventually. But perhaps that represents the most important lesson of their story. Ordinary acts of compassion and justice, even when constrained by historical limitations, can plant seeds that bloom in ways we cannot predict or imagine. The liberation of comfort women reminds us that freedom is never finally won completely. It must be continually fought for by each generation until all survivors find their voices. All societies must find courage to listen to difficult truths. Justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied if the struggle continues across decades and generations.